Welcome to Leadership Line of Sight. My name is Taylor Hack. I am a serial entrepreneur as well as the host of this podcast. And today I have Jesse Crosson with us. Jesse is the founder of Night is Day and has done an incredible job of sharing his experience about being in prison for 19 years. In fact, he was supposed to be in prison for much longer than that, according to what his sentence was. I should rephrase that. He wasn't supposed to be in prison that long, and that's why he got a pardon. So imagine being in prison for 19 years and then waking up one morning and in the afternoon you're free. That was a little bit of your experience, eh, Jesse?
Yeah, it was a pretty mind-boggling shift to go from, what am I going to eat tonight off the commissary to, oh, I'm in the world and I'm driving down the road and I'm shopping at Costco and I'm having a panic attack in public. It was the biggest shift of my life. It was the biggest shift I could imagine.
Well, and also I imagine in some ways it would have been equal to going to prison originally.
And that's such a good point, because people talk about how scared they are to go to prison, but it's not often talked about how difficult it'd be to get out of prison, especially when someone's been there for years or decades. And the acclimation it's a totally new environment, a totally new world. So you have to learn everything over again. Because one of the big problems we have with prisons, and I think in Canada as well, but especially in the United States, is they train you to be really good prisoners. They don't train you to be really good people, and they don't train you to do well in the world.
And that's something that's the biggest challenge overall is that people that become institutionalized, and it sounds like there's just a ton of traps in prison, like the ways to get more time.
Yeah. So there are two main things you have to worry about when you're incarcerated, or actually, let me say three. The first is institutional charges. So at least in Virginia or in some states they have parole, but we have just a good time system, which means that you get a certain amount of time off your sentence, up to 15% off your sentence, if you stay out of trouble. But if you get a charge, I got a charge for bringing syrup out of the chow hall. I was allowed to have the syrup in the chow hall, but the moment I stepped out the door, it was contraband and I got a charge for it. You can have your good time taken away. And in a lot of situations, it really is a trap, because you can be at an institution where you have a cell, you have your sense of privacy, you get out on the yard, it's comfortable. And as a reward for your good behavior, you get sent down to an open dormitory where you're surrounded by 81 other people piled on top of you, where you don't have any privacy in the bathroom, where you're knocking knees with the guy when you're using the bathroom. So the question is, do I catch a charge and stay at this place where I'm actually comfortable and feel safe? Or do I not catch a charge and spend less time in prison in a more miserable environment? Then you have people who can catch, oh, sorry.
No. It sounds to me like that the reward system there isn't consistent with how the prisoners see rewards.
Oh, it's entirely inconsistent. I didn't know a single person who that wanted to go down to a level 2. Because in theory, it would be like, okay, you move towards greater freedom. And if we designed a system, it would be, okay, I've stayed out of trouble, I'm more trusted, I'm therefore able to be responsible for more, let's give them a greater sense of freedom. But instead, what you lose is, again, your privacy and your sense of safety and your sense of quiet, all the things that you value as a person who's incarcerated, you lose.
So isn't that what they call the hierarchy of needs, right?
Sure.
Where at the very bottom, we're talking about food and shelter. Mm-hmm. And then after that, it's about feeling safe. And so what you're saying is that in the beginning you have food and shelter, but then when they move you to a level 2, your sense of safety really, really changes. Instead of dealing with one person while you sleep, you're sleeping in a room with many people where more and less predictable things can happen.
Exactly. And additionally, it's a lot younger crowd, or guys with shorter sentences, because it's a less serious institution. And you would think that would be a better case, but no, you want to be around lifers. You want to be around guys who have 20 and 30 and 50 years, because they are making the best of their life. They've acclimated to the environment and they're saying, hey, how can I live my best life today? It's the young kids who want to fight all the time, or they want to pick up a knife, or they want to do something crazy. Those are the ones that I wanted to stay away from. And that environment put me basically surrounded by them.
Oh, crazy. And that's not the only crazy thing. You were just saying that you caught more time, or you caught an institutional charge for smuggling syrup.
Yeah.
This sounds like something that was part of your apple pie hustle.
It definitely was.
So for those people that don't know, Jesse is an incredible cell. What do we call this? Do we call it inside cell baker?
Well, it wasn't in the cell; it was in the pod. But yeah, call this a prison entrepreneurship. Like we were working on creating wealth within the prison community and allowing the opportunity for growth and franchises. And basically, we smuggled apples back from the chow hall. We cooked them in butter and cinnamon that was also from the kitchen. Or we needed something sweet, so we might use sweeteners, use syrup, or use whatever's available. And then we would have a product that people wanted, and we were able to, we were able to gain wealth and work on generational wealth as I pass on those apple pie secrets to my one-day children.
That's so wild. So you have, I really appreciate having you back. For those people that are just joining us now, there is a part 1 of Jesse on leadership line of sight where we talked a little bit more in detail. But since then, your and my relationship has developed as well. We got to see each other in person in Austin, Texas at South by Southwest. And that was also super cool. I remember this one surreal moment where I was walking along with you and then imagining all the people that you've walked alongside in the last 20 years. And I was like, oh, this is so wild, because you were walking with the CEO and CTO, Scott and Chandra or Chandra and Scott, if I'm CEO and CTO of Eris MD, as well as a surgeon from MD Anderson. At one point we were with Peter from NASA.
Yeah.
So a little bit of a different crowd, hey?
And that's so much of the work that I try to do in the reentry space is giving people a different sense of hope. Like I just came from a leadership summit on working in the community and youth mentorship. And what we found is that so many of the kids that are in the juvenile facility feel safer in that facility than they do in their own homes or in their own communities. And they also feel such a limited sense of hope. It's either go back to the unsafe place or get locked up. The idea of being able to go to a different place or be around different people or different opportunities is just foreign. And the treasurer on my board is a great example of that. And he's been kind of an inspiration for me because he was locked up as a juvenile. And when he got out, he could only get a basically minimum wage job. And he worked his way up to being a manager and he was making $42,000 a year. And that was it. Like that was the pinnacle of success to him. He couldn't imagine that he went beyond that. And he had, growing up in Virginia, never heard of UVA, like the kind of seminal institution in our state, because he was in a crowd that nobody went to college. Somebody said to him one day, you're a smart guy, you're running this business. Like, why aren't you doing more? Why aren't you going to college? Literally 4 years later, he graduates and he's making 6 figures at a Fortune 50 company. But it took that inspiration, it took that exposure. And I'm experiencing that in a way that I never have before by meeting you, by meeting Chandra, by meeting the people there and recognizing that the world is a lot bigger than I ever imagined.
And the parallels are so crazy. Like everybody has their own struggle. You gave an amazing talk at South by Southwest and you were talking about, I think that what was the title of your talk?
Adversity is an incubator.
Yes, because those people in startups are feeling that same thing, not to the same level, right? Like they have but I think a lot of them, if you measured like their scale of 1 to 10 of hope that this will like pan out and of how like rough their life is by comparison to what they've experienced up until then, sure. I thought that was very fitting. That was awesome.
Well, you helped me come up with the idea, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's super fun to jam with people that come from all these different places, and it's been awesome to talk to you off mic, essentially, about some of the things that are going on with your life. And I really want to unpack some of those things because I like that this podcast allows us to almost like document an experience. Right? We'll do this from time to time, and it ends up being these like milestones. So let's kind of hit some document points here. How long has it been since you've been released?
It's been about 20 months.
So 20 months. And if I were to hit some of the highlights in this period, I'm not sure what they would be from your perspective, but I know that the outside world would be like, oh, speaking in front of Congress.
Well, I didn't speak in front of National Congress. I get to speak at the state legislature. But yeah, that's
speaking at the state legislature, that's still a major deal.
It was a pretty neat experience. I had hair, so that was a milestone. The hair is now gone. I've accepted the inevitable. I think that I got out, and in my mind, we talk about exposure or hope or who we walk with, and I thought I was going to be an electrician. I thought that I was going to get a job. Maybe I would make decent money. I'd live in a little shack in the woods, and that would be my experience. But then social media happened, and all of a sudden I'm speaking to thousands of people every day, which is not something that I ever imagined. And then, business opportunities, and then being funded for a nonprofit, literally because of social media and because of social capital and being at the right place at the right time. I met somebody who said, hey, I think what you're doing is really important. And as a matter of fact, if you start a 501c3, I'm going to give you seed funding. I'm going to allow you to do what you're doing full time which was amazing because I went from thinking I was going to be an electrician to like struggling to get by to working all these side jobs to all of a sudden being in a place where I can focus on the thing that I'm most passionate about. So I would say the milestones have just been opportunities after opportunities after opportunities in a way that I never could have imagined.
That's something that's super cool. And also the way that you continually document your experience. Like we were together for pretty much a week, and watching you grab an idea, probably what looked like roll it twice in your mind and then step away and just like talk to your camera. Your turnaround for being able to articulate those ideas, like that's a real talent.
Thank you. It's it depends. And the problem I have with that is I'm interested in kind of a healing perspective. I'm interested in a growth perspective. And a lot of times what I find, especially on social media, is that people don't want that. People want the crazy story, or they want the outlandish story, or they want something that makes them kind of feel good or feel excited or maybe even feel scared. So I've tried to really focus on that, and engagement suffers. But what I've found is that the audience that I've been able to connect with, and the personal messages I get, and the people that I met today at this conference, it resonates with them in a way that's really important. And yet being able to kind of share those ideas. I met with a veteran the other day who runs a nonprofit for veterans getting out because veteran suicide is through the roof. And he said, man, you're saying all the things that I want to be able to say. Like, it's so helpful to be able to hear you say that. And that means the world to me, because I recognize it's not just about me, and it's not just about my particular struggle or experience, but it's a universal thing. It's a human experience of struggling to find our place and our identity and our meaning.
Well, that's something that like I feel from you as we talk, is that you have found a spot and are looking for a way to connect in new ways, right?
Yeah.
You probably, you probably feel like the weight of like some level of responsibility, saying like, oh, I'm going to make the best out of this situation.
Yeah. Well, because I recognize that I'm in a position where I can speak for a group of people that don't have anyone speak for them. People who have been incarcerated, people who have made mistakes in their lives, people who feel like they're in a hopeless place. And so I could both speak to those people and hopefully give them a different perspective or a different idea, but also speak for them and say, hey, the stereotypes are not all true. Like, the places you're thinking that people are, or where you think they are, or who do you think they are, is not necessarily true. And so I do feel a sense of obligation to speak for those people, but also to be realistic, because I think some people are on like one side of this imaginary fence of like, hey, everybody who went to prison is a bad person, is always going to be a bad person, or everybody who went to prison is a victim, and you know, it's just a terrible thing and we need to completely undo the system. And it's like, no, I think there's a mix in there. Let's talk about what it is and what allowed me to change and what we can provide for other people. The youth mentorship group today, what can we provide these kids that's going to allow them to get their lives together and have the most meaningful, healthy, productive life?
Yeah, I definitely see what you mean there, where you know, it almost looks like if you end up in court, this is a sorting bin for whether or not they think that you can recover, I guess, and become what you describe as a returning citizen. But they don't realize that once someone is in prison, there is change.
Yeah, oh, very much so. And you know, that was the thing, because it was so fundamental to my life. I had this deep doubt and insecurity my entire life that I wasn't enough, or that something was wrong with me, or that I was broken. And when the judge sentenced me that day to serve 32 years in prison, which was twice the high point of the sentencing guidelines, it felt like a validation of that deepest fear. It felt like he has seen me and measured me and found me wanting. Like, I am not adequate. I am not enough. And so many kids get that message when they get kicked out of school, or when they have an interaction where they're taught that they're less than, or when they get locked up in juvenile detention or in prison. And it takes an entirely balancing force of good, of hope, of inspiration to lift someone out of that place. And when we don't provide that, when we only beat people down and never build them up, we can't be surprised that they're living kind of at the ground level.
Man, I want to talk a little bit about lowlights like that. So we talk a lot about highlights, but you were 18 years old. You were going into court, and they said the high point of the sentence was 15 years. Is that right?
The morning of sentencing, the guidelines called for from 8 to 13 years. The Commonwealth submitted a motion and modified them to 10 to 16 years. And then, the judge, because guidelines in Virginia are discretionary. In other words, the judge doesn't have to follow them. They're for his advice, but he doesn't have to follow them by law. So the judge could give me up to, the 32 years that he gave me.
And with that, did you have priors?
I'd stolen beer when I was a juvenile. That was the only prior that I had.
So you had no priors, but this was something that was gun violence involving drugs. Mm-hmm. And that was part of it. Did the judge explain himself?
I remember he said a couple lines. Like, the first thing was, he did not know the sentence that he gave me when he read off these things into 10 years with 5 suspended and 5 years with this. And my lawyer said, Your Honor, like, what's the total? What did you sentence him to? And he says, I don't know. I just told you. And they had to have the court reporter read back and do the math to say what the total sentence was. And then it was really, he said, I think you tried to kill 2 people and you're glad you didn't. And I think that you basically, I don't remember his exact words, but something like, I think you're a bad actor, a bad apple. Like, I think you're a bad person and you just need to spend this time inside.
And so at that point, this was like twice the length of your life up to this point.
Basically, yeah.
Holy crap. Like what was it like? So in that moment, can you explain anything about, it sounds to me like I would be like massively overwhelmed.
It was weird because there was a split. There was that part of feeling like my deepest fear was validated, that I was worthless and broken. And also this almost childish sense of outrage, like this isn't fair and this isn't right. Because my lawyer had basically assured me I was going to get about 10 years. So it was like, this isn't what he said. This isn't what's supposed to happen. But then also a sense of shame on top of that. Like, how dare I feel this way? Like, look at the harm that I caused. Look at the people that I hurt. Like, I need to take responsibility for that. But as I went back, and they actually put me on suicide watch in one of the cells because they were so worried because they were not used to people getting these lengthy sentences or getting double the high point of the guidelines. And I was sitting in there. I just remember this sense of like anger, being like, I will not allow this to define me. Like, I will not allow this to be me. And it took a lot of tears to kind of get through that, but get to the point where like, whatever it is, I'm going to find a way through. I'm going to find a way to get out of this and not have this be the thing that defines me for the rest of my life.
And then what's the flow like from there? So you, so up until that point, how long did it take from when you were arrested to the end of court proceedings?
About 10 months.
And during that time, where were you?
I was at the Albemarle Charlottesville Regional Jail.
And what's that like, by maybe contrast to prison?
Jail time is terrible. You're locked inside all day. I didn't see the outside. I didn't feel fresh air. I didn't feel sunlight for that 10 months. We didn't even have a window. We had these like slits in the wall on the opposite sides of the bars. It was basically set up like a zoo, to where the staff walks in one side and they look through the bars at you where you're at, like in your zoo activity or in your cell. We would get to the gym once a week, which was just a big open space that sometimes had a basketball and sometimes didn't. That was once a week. Otherwise, we were just locked inside. Most of the time the lights didn't work because they'd been kicked out or they'd been damaged. So you had like a little bit of light in one corner. There was one small TV and that was it. So the difference for me is I had the opportunity to learn because, you know, my mother had invested at a very early time and said, hey, you're going to do something with this time. We're not going to allow you to sit there and just kind of rot. So I was enrolled in college classes. I was doing college classes where other guys were just sleeping all day or were just kind of like making wine to drink themselves silly or trying to find anything to numb the pain of being just locked in a room day after day with nothing to do.
And in that case, are you sharing a cell with someone or are you on your own?
So those were double cells. These were the worst cells that I've ever seen. You literally, if you lay in the bed, you are about that far from the toilet. And so you would want to lay your head the other way so your head's not next to the toilet. You were locked in the cells at night, though eventually the doors were just broken so often they just stopped locking them. But I mean, you could reach out your hands without even extending your arms and touch both sides of the cell. It was a tiny, tiny place. The person was on top of you. We had no AC. So in the summer, it was 110 degrees. There's no airflow. It was a pretty horrendous environment to be in.
Holy, that's just brutal. And now coming through that, you end up at the end of that 10 months and then you're sentenced. How long is it from that point to when you end up going to a prison?
So I got really lucky. And this is another example of privilege that I think kind of permeates my story. Because my father had been a substance use counselor and had worked with the DOC before, he kind of called in a favor because back then it was usually about 3 to 6 months before you would get transferred to DOC because they had a lack of beds. And now it can be years. We have guys sitting in the county jails for 2 and 3 years before they get transferred to DOC because there are no beds. So they're doing their state time, but they're in the worst environment possible. But he called in and said, hey, I really need you to do me a favor. Like, I'm worried about my son. Like, he's in a really difficult place. So they got me out of there in about 2 weeks, where again, people would have waited 3 or 6 months. And I got to go into a receiving prison and start the actual prison experience.
What's a receiving prison like?
So there were 2 sides of it. The first side is extremely restrictive. It was very similar. You're in the cell for 23 hours a day, except for a 1 hour out for rec or for showers. And you go to chow and then come back. But you were outside for rec. Like, we had an hour outside in the sun. And I remember I burned every day for 2 weeks because I wasn't used to sunlight. I was as pale as I'd ever been in my life. The food was a lot better. The mobility, you could buy things. I remember like cigarettes were a big thing because you could smoke there, whereas you couldn't smoke in the jail. And everybody was so excited to have that. But the commissary, like the food you could buy was better. And it was where people started to kind of get a sense of identity. Like I would pay commissary to the guy to bring me a whole bunch of books out of the library because you were supposed to be able to visit the library every day, but like sometimes you wouldn't, and it might only have like 10 books, but there were good ones in the back, and you had to. It's just corruption, like you can imagine anywhere else. So I just spent my time reading, and then go outside and work out as hard as I can, get a shower, and come back in and read some more.
That's interesting. So that first point, and how long are you normally in a receiving prison for?
I'm not sure what it is now. Back then, it was about 3 months, which is what I spent.
And so going from jail to there, when you were going there, was that intimidating for you?
Oh, terrifying. I had no idea what to expect. In the
And how did
jail,
it?
in the jail, there's this narrative. You hear these two different stories, which don't make any sense, but oh, prison is so much better. You're going to love it. It's so much better. Also, people are getting like sexually assaulted every day, and it's super violent and it's super scary. And it was like, all right, these things don't really like mix in my mind. Like, how does this thing? And what I found was that it was a lot better, but I didn't know that coming in. So yeah, I was terrified.
And a lot of people are really concerned about getting taken advantage of. The worst case of that, I think, that they can imagine is either being killed or being sexually assaulted. And how did that compare to what it actually was like to be there?
So at the receiving prison, it was a much lesser of a threat than where I went eventually. People were still kind of in flux. I mean, we had guys get robbed, we had guys get beaten up. I think we even had one guy get stabbed, but it was much more of a rare experience. When I got to the major facility, Virginia back then was levels 4 or 1 through 6, and I was at a level 4. We had a lot of violent incidents. Sexual assault was actually really rare in the system. I'm sure it did happen, but nothing like what we saw in the movies, at least in Virginia. But yeah, violence was fairly common. You'd see somebody. I remember I was 3 days in where I see a guy pull out a Rambo knife and start chasing this other guy around the pod after that guy's weapon breaks, and it was horrifying. It was watching like gladiator games in the space that I live in.
That's crazy. So when you come from the outside, obviously you were already involved in dangerous activities at that point. And then you come to the inside and you're starting to see that, oh, okay, so this is the place where people that do dangerous activities collect.
Yeah. And there are no guns. So all of a sudden things are a little bit different, or, weapons take a different shape, but also that greater sense of scrutiny. Whereas like when I was running around in my cocaine madness and carrying a gun, I never once worried about getting arrested. And part of that was just that I was delusional. Part of it was that it was just much less likely that somebody would just stop me. Whereas in prison, some people carry knives for safety, but they're getting stopped and patted down maybe every day, maybe several times a day. It might be 3 a.m. The officers come run in their cell to search for what they have. And so guys have to come up with this really delicate balance of, do I choose to have a weapon and feel a sense of safety? Or do I choose to not have a weapon? And maybe, the guys would say, I'd rather be caught with it than without it. But it's just this crazy mindset where you're literally like wondering about your safety or wondering about getting in trouble and spending more time in prison.
That actually kind of wheels me back in my mind to how hard was it for you to get a gun when you did?
Oh, incredibly easy. So ironically, the shooting, the non-fatal shooting that I committed, the 2 men that I shot had stolen that gun originally, sold it to my friend who sold it to me. But we were talking at the panel today. One of the kids goes to our local high school and says every kid on the basketball team has a gun in his locker. And it's not for school. It's not a school shooting. It's because they don't feel safe going home at the end of the day to the neighborhood they live in if they don't have a gun. And that's just a reality in a lot of the U.S.
So what you're saying is that the school you were in, people had guns for safety. And then when you went to a maximum security prison, that was the same.
Well, to clarify, it wasn't the school that I was in. I went to a different school. But yeah, in this city school, which has great academic program, great system, but has a very diverse population. You have some people that live in tremendous wealth and some people who live in abject poverty. And for a lot of the people who live in poverty or more challenging circumstances, they feel the need to have weapons for safety. And yeah, that mindset definitely continues on.
Oh, that's wild. So then when it comes to being on the inside, you were saying that people are patted down regularly, but what does it take to get a weapon inside?
Well, it depends if you're a creative type or if you have money. Like, there are different routes to it. I watch people fashion weapons out of pretty much anything, from razor blades to make like kind of slashing weapons, to pieces of the fence to make ice picks, to drawer rails to make kind of more traditional blades or bowies, to a lock and a sock where you would run a sock through a padlock. pretty much anything you can think of. And you could buy them and be really nice and fashioned, have a handle and have a lanyard, or you could make them yourself because you didn't want anybody to know you had them. It was a thriving industry. And I know a lot of guys who that's how they supported themselves. But that was one of the things that I did not want to get involved in. Like, I don't want to be responsible for giving somebody a tool that they could take another person's life with. I've made this mistake in the past. I've been a part of this life, and I don't want to do that anymore.
So when people are going from receiving prison into the what do you call that? The place that you ended up, was it maximum security prison?
Yeah, I guess it was like a high, medium, or a low max. But yeah, it was called Nottoway Correctional Center.
Okay. And then going into there, how was that? What was it like to acclimate to that from the receiving prison?
It was much more structured and regimented. And what it took me time to realize was that the reality is the threat wasn't there in the same way that I perceived it initially, because it was really about people who were engaged in a certain type of lifestyle and how they conflicted with one another. And there were people who got taken advantage of. There were people who were kind of innocent bystanders. But for the most part, it was people living a life and engaging in things that kind of brought them into proximity with violence or brought them into proximity with conflict. And so what I had to figure out after a couple of years of stumbling and making bad decisions or being around the wrong people was, how do I find the group of people that I want to be like? Like, how do I find the people who are living the life that I aspire to, or that I want to learn from, or that I want to be associated with? Once I found that, the experience changed pretty dramatically.
How did you find them?
Trial and error, a lot of trial and error.
I think a lot of people find it making friends in places with less consequences to be quite difficult.
Yeah. Well, and there's a different level of, a lot of the people that I know in there, and I just went up to spend Easter with a buddy of mine and his family that I've been locked up with. But a lot of people that I knew, I trusted, but they weren't my friends. Like, it was this almost kind of like mutual relationship where, like, we've got each other's backs, but we're not like, there may not be like an emotional connection or a friendship there, but it's somebody that you can rely on. And I had a bunch of relationships like that. And I was fortunate to make some friends and have some mentors and have some mentees over the years. But yeah, it's interesting how some of those relationships were almost like transactional, or almost were like pragmatic, like, hey, let's have each other's backs because then we know everything's okay.
So what was the difference between that trust and being a friend?
Probably interaction or sharing, or, I mean, there were guys that I trusted or could come to me and ask me to do something, or vice versa, that I probably didn't talk to, but, maybe 5 or 6 times after the initial like building or recognition, or, it would literally be like somebody would come up to you and be like, hey man, I really like the way you move or the way you carry yourself. Like, I got you. If anything happens, I got you. And there has to be something before that just doesn't happen out of the blue. But then I may not talk to this guy for 6 months, but he may come to me and be like, hey man, I really need to do me a favor. Like, and I can know that this isn't something where he's exploiting me or he's trying to take advantage of me. He's shown himself to be the kind of guy who's not going to ask for help unless he really needs it. But also the people that I found, what was really good is they would respect those boundaries. Like, once I really cleaned up my act and I wasn't doing anything, people would come to me and ask me for a favor. I'd be like, no, that's my line. Like, I don't carry a weapon. I don't do this. I don't do that. And they would always respect it. And it would be like, okay, well, can you help me with this? Or can you put me in contact with this guy? Or it was just interesting because there was a level of respect once you got capacity, kind of an initial BS, where people understood where you were and they respected that.
Talk to me a little bit more about your lines. You say you refused to carry your weapon.
Sure. Yeah. So I remember the first cell partner I had at that major prison, the first day was like, all right, here's my knife. Here's where I hide it. Like, I just want to let you know. So if anything happens, like, I'm going to take the fall for it. Because that was one of the rules. Like, if you have something, you have to own up to it. And that's another of the things at the lower levels. It's so frustrating because everybody's so worried about getting out the door. They're not worried about the reputation anymore. So they're just telling on each other or throwing their stuff on somebody else's bunk or planning it on somebody. It's just this kind of BS. Whereas in those institutions that they're going to be there for a long time, their word or their reputation is the most important thing. So he's going to take this charge. He's going to own up to his stuff, because otherwise everybody's going to know that he's not a trustworthy guy. But I remember he asked, he was like, do you want one? Do you need one? Like, where are you at? And I got into a conflict one time where I actually ended up getting an assault charge because somebody stole from me. And somebody said, hey, do you need a knife? Like, do you want to finish this? And I said, no, because I don't want to be in the position where I'm going to take someone's life or someone is going to take my life. Like, I want to stay away from that as much as possible. And if I have to get into a conflict, I would rather be the one who gets hurt and feel like at least I'm not losing my sense of safety. And hopefully I can get through this and not be maimed or not be killed. But I don't want to engage in that behavior anymore. I don't want to deal with the consequences. And I also just don't want to be that person anymore.
That's a hard reality.
Yeah.
To come to the decision that, I'll be the one that is hurt, because so many people would look at it the other way.
Yeah. And I understand why. It's just, I think that getting that 32-year sentence really shifted, and it scared the crap out of me because I didn't know if I was going to make it out of there. to an 18-year-old kid saying you're going to get out at 45 at the best case or 50 at the worst, I couldn't imagine that. It didn't seem like a real number.
Let's go back to that. So let's say that there was a third person on this podcast, and it's 18-year-old Jesse, right? So if you were saying like, hey, I made some mistakes when I first went to jail. Let's just start there. What do you think the mistakes that you may have made there were?
Feeling the need to prove myself or caring more about what other people thought, getting around the wrong people, or kind of chasing the fun or the fast, or the guy who's selling cigarettes. Oh, cool. Like, I want to get in with him. I want to be with the cool kids, rather than saying, hey, this is who I am. Like, this is my lane, and I'm going to stay in it. And I get a lot of people who are getting ready to go to prison or facing time, or, reach out and say, hey, what can I do? And what I tell them is, this is an opportunity. It may not be the one you would choose, the one you'd like, and you're probably not going to enjoy it, but it's an opportunity, so treat it as such. What are you going to do with this time on a daily basis? What is your routine going to be? What are your goals? What are you going to work towards? Like, how are you going to grow through this experience? And that's what I would tell my 18-year-old self. Like, hey, all these things that feel so important right now, I'm promising you in 5 years or 10 years, they're not going to matter at all. What does matter, what is important, is you becoming the person you want to be, so you can live at peace with yourself, so you can feel proud of yourself, so you can do things that you're actually proud of for the first time in your life.
That's a really interesting perspective, because I see parallels. Like, I end up being a consultant for top producers in business, and I talk to them a lot about an ideal calendar and building the person inside you that can make it to the next level. And it's so crazy that advice is the same in prison.
Well, I mean, it's like we said about the South by Southwest talk. Adversity is adversity. We may have a different kind of hedonic set point. We have a different level of, distress relative to the situation, but it's the same experience. How are we going to let this difficult and uncomfortable experience either shape us for the better or make us into the person we want to be, or how are we going to let it erode us and kind of break us down?
And what about the same thing when you ended up getting to Nottoway Correctional Facility? What do you feel as though were mistakes that you wouldn't want the past you to go through in that space?
I was still emotional, and I think the emotion came out of fear. I actually, at the presentation of the guy, I liked what the guy said. He said, as human beings, we only have the capacity to either be in a state of love or be in a state of fear. We have to choose what that is. And that sounds very non-traditional for a prison setting. But what I found was later, as I lived in a state of love, of care for the people around me, of trying to figure out how I could help, how I could support them, also how I could take care of myself, I didn't get into those conflicts. But when I was in that state of fear, when I felt like I needed to have a response, or I needed to talk back to somebody, or I needed to set an example, I was consistently living in that state and creating more and more fearful or difficult or damaging experiences.
So it would have been try to keep an understanding of where you're at emotionally, and stay between, either being too emotional or trying to suppress everything.
Yeah, very much so. And I honestly, I still struggle with that. That's the biggest thing in therapy, is with a history of trauma, is finding a space in which it's not overwhelming nor I'm shut down. And for me, that threshold is very small. And it's something that I still struggled with, to be able to go through kind of reprocessing those difficult experiences, because the times that I went through them, I wasn't resourced and I didn't know how to better manage my emotions or deal with distress.
Yeah, I think that's like almost like operating temperature.
Yeah.
You can't be too hot or it's not going to work out. And you also can't be too cold or it's not going to work out. You got to try to stay between those two lines. For people that are in high production, it ends up being that self-doubt where I feel like an imposter when I'm below this line. And then when you're above this line, that's the egomaniac, right? And the way that it affects most people is more through their relationships than anything else. They become disconnected.
Sure. I mean, and you and I have talked about this at South by Southwest. The people who are successful are successful because of the relationships in their life. Because you can have the best idea in the world, but if you can't find people to connect with, people to support you, or people you can support, it doesn't really matter. It's really all about relationships. And I didn't understand that for a long time. And thankfully, I actually had an old head teach me that. Remember, we were sitting on the steps waiting to go into the lieutenant's office to apply for this house band job, this 27-cent an hour job. And he said, hey, I see you over there, and you're reading and you're studying, and like, that is great. And you're going to spend the next 10 years educating yourself, and you're going to grow in so many ways. But you're going to wake up one day and you're going to realize that life is about people, that living on an island is never going to make you happy. It's never going to make you feel content. It's never going to feel like you have meaning. Like, you have to find a way to have people in your space. And that was a shift for me, because I'd never heard that. And especially in that place, I was drawn into myself, and I was only worried about myself. And I had had some bad experiences at that point. So I was just staying away from everybody. And it really let me understand that life is about people.
That's interesting. So as you felt yourself shift, Like you talk often about friends that you did time with, right? And that probably was where some of those people started to present themselves, or you started to recognize those opportunities.
Sure, and there were a whole range of experiences. What I tried to remember is there's something I can learn from everybody. Even this guy over here acting a fool, being a complete jackass, I can learn maybe what I don't want to do, or I can try to understand how he got to that point. And there were people that I said, okay, I can learn from this person, or maybe I can share something or teach this person. And then there were people, those few, that really did. They became friends. We went through the struggle together. And I think any kind of common struggle really creates bonds that are difficult to replicate anywhere else. And what I found is that once I left, it's difficult to maintain those relationships, like because we're in such dramatically different circumstances, we don't have the same experience. But when my buddies get out, or the ones who got out before me, we're right back into that common, like we know where we were, we know the struggle we're in now, and it allows that bond to really grow. But it's been interesting to see how that shifted over the years.
Do you feel dissociated now?
At the moment, no, but that is my superpower. That is my regular practice anytime things happen, because I got really good, both in childhood and in prison, at stepping away from my emotions, or stepping away from my body, or stepping away from that discomfort. To give you an example, there was a really horrendous attack on somebody one day. It was a gang issue, and I remember they were just sitting there laughing and stomping on this guy's face on the yard, just like basically trying to kill him. And my role as a prisoner was to like not draw attention, to not intervene. And there was something about that just internally was like a break for me. I was like, I can't be this person. Like, I can't be in a place where this is my job, is to basically watch them murder this guy. And that was when I decided, like, I wanted to become somebody else. But there were still those moments where I can't intervene in a gang dispute. Like, I'm a single guy. This is not going to go well if I do. But at the same time, there's a moral thing that I struggle with. And what that caused was cognitive dissonance, where I would just step back. I wasn't really there. I was in my mind, functionally, but I wasn't in my body, because my body was horrified and traumatized by that.
Yeah, that's something that I imagine is something that you still feel triggered about.
Very much so, yeah.
So when you take a look at like your life before prison, and then your life during prison, and your life after prison, there's like almost no commonalities.
It's a very different experience all the way around. I think the same universals that I talk about with adversity and growth, they all apply, but the actual logistics day by day, yeah, it could not. It's three separate lives, and it really feels like that. I remember a buddy of mine got out, and he sent me an email. And a lot of guys get out and don't stay in contact, and I understand now why. He said, it felt like I woke up from a bad dream, and I was finally back where I was supposed to be. And that was exactly my experience. I got out, and it wasn't like, oh, how am I going to do this? Oh, this is, it was like a light switch, and I was like, I'm supposed to be here in the world. But what I found was a very different world than I left, and very different challenges and very different struggles. And I was an adult for the first time in my life. I'm having to pay bills, and I'm having to figure things out. And again, I had a tremendous number of responsibilities, but dealing with the survivor's guilt from the people who left behind, who worked just as hard and who were just as deserving of me, but who didn't get a second chance, feeling needed to carry on and have a message of healing and work with youth and work with people getting out. It's difficult to balance that, because that's, again, dramatically different than the experience I had before.
That whole like parallel life thing was that always constant, where, while you were in prison, did you imagine who you could have been had that not been there? Was that something that just walked along with you?
Yeah, a lot of guys talked about that. I never really knew, because I didn't have any sense of hope when I was, 16 and 17. I didn't see a future. And mine was in a less dramatic way. A lot of the kids that I talked to, especially in the juvenile center, said, everybody I know is dead or locked up by 16 or 18. Like, why would I try to plan for a future? And mine wasn't that deep or that dark, but I had no idea. I didn't have a sense of self. Like, I basically, as a kid, was running around trying to like meet everybody else's needs or expectations or make people like me. So I didn't really know who I was or what I wanted or what I liked. So I couldn't imagine a future, because I was just constantly in this state of like trying to make other people essentially like approve of what I was doing. So the idea of actually having something that I wanted to do, or a path that I was going to take, was just almost foreign.
And what does that look like now for you when you start to wheel things out? Does that still feel like something that you can't touch?
Sometimes. One of my biggest struggles is, like you said, either this self-doubt, this like, I'm an imposter, I'm in the wrong place, going to South by Southwest to speak when, the person that we were talking to, this world-renowned medical professional, is like, my dream since I was a child has been to speak here. I'm like, what the F am I doing here? Like, I felt completely invalid, but I'm finding that space, and I'm finding a place where I can believe in myself, and I can get in touch with that, because the people that we met and the conversations we had and some of the conversations we've had since, it's like, wait, there is a sense of possibility. I get to explore this, and I don't have to live and do what somebody else did, because a lot of the work that I do now, doesn't necessarily come from a healthy place, or didn't originally. It was, I feel like I have to do this, or I feel like this is what other people expect of me. So I'm working in the reentry space, or I'm working in the narrative storytelling space. What I'm realizing now is, hey, these parts that I like, that I'm passionate about, I can do those. But these parts that I don't have to. I can choose to do something else. And it's obvious as that sounds, it's a radical thing for me to experience in my own mind.
That was something that was like for me as well. I always felt like I was looked past when I was a kid, whereas an adult, people are like, you, they don't know exactly what to call me. But the thing that a lot of people when I was a kid looked at was just like, man, you're a real challenge, right?
And I think that was what was so interesting, because I think about the kids who end up in the juvenile facility and the people who end up at South by Southwest. And what I see is a very similar common experience for most of them. Being a difficult kid, getting in trouble, not like wanting to color inside the lines, but the kids who had opportunities, whether they came from wealth or they just found a mentor or they found someone who kind of steered them in a different direction, they end up being the CEOs and CTOs and real estate magnates. And the kids who don't end up in juvenile detention or end up in prison or end up struggling. And it's the same quality and the same personality. And it's just whether, are you running a neighborhood block, or are you running a drug empire, or are you running a business?
I couldn't agree more. And I see it as a frequency of opportunity and a frequency of safety nets.
Yeah.
So
true.
there's some people that come from like the worst places and they only get one opportunity and it'll take them to some place like the NBA. Yeah. Right. But if that opportunity were to slip by, then they may be those 16 to 18-year-olds that are going to prison or dying. Whereas in my circumstance, that's where I really identified with you is that I was in trouble. I was hanging out with people that had guns and stole cars. And the way that it could have slipped that way was just basically the fact that I had more opportunity for failure without consequence. Exactly. And and that was something that I feel as though like immediate bond when you and I first started talking. And then it was so awesome to see you in person, because I was like, oh yeah, this feels exactly the same. And with South by Southwest, it's a place, but the mentality is almost like the Mutant Academy from X-Men.
That's exactly how it felt.
Yeah.
People were asking me yesterday, because I met people at the event that follow me on social media, and they said, hey, I've never been, or it's my favorite thing. Like, how was your experience? It's really hard to describe. The best thing that I can say is, like, my whole life, I feel like I've been looking for my tribe, and that felt like my tribe. And I was like, this is amazing. Like, I want to do this.
It's just wild, because like the truth is that what it takes to get into that space is to be exceptional. And the term I think in yoga is called namaste, which is the excellence in me recognizes the excellence in you. Yeah. And that was something that I felt very deeply about when I first started to get involved with tech and with some of these people that were making like world-changing they were making world-changing inventions. They were having concepts that were able to change the lens of perception of the people around them. Like, look at a guy like Worley, Yeah. Worley can literally help you into the matrix.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
It's astonishing to spend time with him.
What's so interesting to me about him, though, is that I didn't know his professional background. I see him up as a keynote speaker, but when I spoke to him, he was perceptive in a way that very few people are. Like, he saw things about me that very few people know, and there was a connection there. So I see his exceptional qualities just in human interaction, and then to find out everything he's accomplished professionally and in the tech world and I mean, beyond that, it just blows my mind, because I see all the different levels or all the different facets of how exceptional he is. And I saw them in you and in Chandra and in Scott and in pretty much everybody we met. And it was mind blowing to see that.
It's terrifying, because you're like, I like this person. I'm having a great conversation with you, with them. Like, I was sitting with Sue Black when we were on that rooftop. So we're sitting on a rooftop, and now if we do, I have a video of that where we kind of scan the people there. Yeah. And then if you pick them out and name them afterwards, you're like, holy crap. Like, I can't even arrange meetings like this. It's mind blowing. And then I meet Sue Black, and then I later learned that it's Dr. Sue Black. And then I later learned that it's Dr. Sue Black, Officer of Excellence, Order of the British Empire. Yeah. And you're like, oh, wow. I don't know how to relate to that person, but I feel like Sue is like my adopted British nan, right?
Yeah. And the level of comfort, and that's everybody that I saw, I didn't see a single person there who was trying to be something they weren't, or were flaunting their wealth, or were flaunting their opportunity. What I saw was Sue, who's incredibly accessible and warm and comfortable, saying, oh, I've done a few things in my life, and then listing off more accomplishments than I ever could have imagined in a history book, but not having a sense of like pride or ego about it, just saying, hey, this is a path that I got to, and here's what I see in you. Everybody that I saw was giving rather than just taking. It was absolutely exceptional.
It's amazing, but I also feel as though sometimes it gets missed. Like one of the things that I asked Sue was about how her children see her and if she thinks that her children are proud of her. But when your life is like hers and the people you spend time with are people that most people don't have access to, it's tough for the people that are close to you to recognize what that is, or even to like, I guess that's outside of your relationship, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Or even to see it in ourselves. I mean, what I found when I talked to everybody, when I mentioned, hey, I'm really doubting myself, or this feels like an imposter syndrome, the CEO and the CTO and the head of venture capital is like, yeah, I dealt with that too, or I dealt with that last week, or I still do. And so what I found was it's this common experience of us all failing to see ourselves and needing each other to reflect in ourselves our best qualities, to see the way another person describes us or perceives us, the things that we can't see or perceive about ourselves.
I couldn't agree more. And also, it's almost like those people are the people that help you go to altitude.
Yeah, very much so.
Like they're all acclimating just like you are. They all feel weird, just like you do.
Mm-hmm. Well,
so
for the kids today, we were talking about the youth mentoring conference. We were asking about what was, the most important and the most exceptional. And it came back to, it's not about a curriculum. It's not about a set of data. It's about relations. It's about being relational and building relationships that change the way these kids see themselves. That's why I was handing these stickers out. These were designed by, as it says, artists at the Juvenile Detention Center. And one of our big things is we want them to be seen as artists, not as kids who screwed up or as criminals or as hopeless or as whatever. So as we put these up around stores, we have them at South by Southwest, and these kids see, hey, wait, I can be an artist in the world. I can do things in a different way. But it's based on that relationship. It's based on seeing them and knowing them and validating them in a way that can't be done just through a curriculum. That can't just be done through, a data set. That has to be about relationships.
That's a great message. And also to strip away those labels, because I think that reinforces that element that you felt about yourself, is like when you put on, when you put on the outfit of a prisoner, that was an affirming level or an affirming label that you were of no value to society.
Yeah.
And now you see that other people are wearing those labels, whether or not they're wearing a prison uniform.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I see that. I see how much the way someone is labeled affects them in their life. And that's why I think language is important, and the idea of person-centered language, and literally saying an incarcerated person rather than a prisoner, because prisoner becomes that person's identity, just like CEO becomes that person's identity. And if it's not a person, if we don't actually see the whole of a person and their value and their needs, it's very easy to dismiss them and kind of push them to the bottom of the pile, or it's very easy to elevate them and no longer connect. And everybody that I know needs a connection in their life. And if they're just the hero or the seer or the whatever successful person, they lack for that, and they suffer in very similar ways to the person who's pushed to the bottom.
Yeah, I think that that's something that I like about the language that you use. You refer to people that other people call ex-cons as returning citizens.
Yeah. And
that promotes acceptance. That promotes like almost also that they need help, in some way they're almost like a society refugee.
It's a very good way to look at it. We have these different models. We have a model of like exclusion and one of inclusion. Like, are we pushing people to the side so they can get better and come back stronger and be a part of our community? Or if we're ever going to stigmatize them and keep them outside? And when you look at the barriers, like we live in an area where housing is an incredible problem. Well, we have people who are kind of stripped away. I had 12 guys in the jail the other day when they were talking about what they needed. They were all going to be homeless when they got out. They have nowhere to live. There's no place for them to go. So they're literally leaving the jail with a trash bag over their shoulder with whatever they've managed to amass while they were in there. And then they're going to go get on the 3 to 6 month waiting list for a homeless shelter, or go hope they can find a place to stay. And if we want them to succeed and work a job and go to school or like contribute to the community, we have to start with the most basic things. And we just don't have those. And until we have kind of a different perspective about, hey, how can we welcome you back in and support you in being this new person? We're going to continue to have people who feel kind of shoved to the side or maybe end up on the couch of the house they don't need to be in. That's going to bring them right back to that life. And the recidivism rate is going to continue to be what it is.
This is such an incredibly huge problem.
It really is.
And it feels like the problem is as locked away as the prisoners are.
I like that. But I think that's changing. And I'm kind of grateful. I obviously would have liked to have gotten out of prison 10 years earlier, but I'm grateful because the conversations we're having today, the people who came up to me after the event yesterday and after the event today and wanted my card and wanted to talk to me, that wasn't happening 10 years ago. There was no interest or curiosity or drive to fix things 10 years ago. And for whatever reason, that narrative has shifted. People are interested in addressing needs. They're interested in addressing housing and services for returning citizens and transitional support. And all these things are happening in a different way than they ever have. And it feels like some of those doors are opening a little bit, or some of those ideas or concepts are changing.
Yeah, I am so surprised that people have got this far, because like, look at how many years that we've had the option when we see something is no longer being of value directly to us, right? We go to whether or not it's going to be garbage, recycle, or reused.
Yeah.
You know? And then with people, we're just like, no, garbage, like landfill only.
Yeah, pretty much. And it's this bootstrap idea. And I think it's also fear. And we come back to the idea of fear and love. I think people live in a zero-sum game mindset. They're like, oh, of course I want kids to get an education, but like, I got to make sure my kid gets an education. So I can't support funding in another district or in another neighborhood. And that's what it becomes. It becomes this fear of, well, we can't help these people because if we do, then, well, what are we going to do? Or if we can't help, it just is this mindset where we don't realize that we're genuinely all in this together. The catchphrase of the pandemic is the thing that we could focus on to change the world. And that me helping someone in another community is going to help that community, which is in turn going to help me. And recognizing we don't have to only focus on ourselves. And in fact, by only focusing on ourselves, we're just making ourselves more miserable and actually limiting our future opportunities.
Yeah, I find that it's such a double-edged sword on how people see that. Mm-hmm. They're like, oh yeah, when I contribute to society, it comes back to me. But then when you ask them when they're not in front of anyone else, they're like, well, you contribute a little bit here, but like those people are going to take everything from you.
Yeah.
And it ends up drawing them back. Where do you think that we can approach this problem? So if we can't just blow them all up and start with a clean slate, right? I know that you were on television in Australia recently. That's what they used to do, right? Is just ship him off, and he's like, "Here's your island. It's better than ours." But
yeah.
What do you think would be the first right steps to dealing with this? Do you deal with it for the next generation of people that will become incarcerated people? Or do you start to try to take a look at the people that are incarcerated now, and how do you even measure them?
I mean, one, I think that's a false dichotomy that we fall into a lot, where we have to pick one or the other. Because if we don't have wraparound services, what we're going to do is end up prioritizing something to the cost of something else. And I work a lot in the prison reentry space and reform work because that's what I have lived experience with. But I do think that we need to be investing in our youth. We need to be investing in pre-K and social emotional learning and the basic things. As simple as at the crowdfunding pitch last night, there was a woman who said, hey, I got really lucky. Like my mom married a man who had a bunch of money and I watched her lose everything once he died because she didn't know how to manage it, because everybody in my family, everybody from everywhere that I came from didn't know how to manage money. So my goal was to make sure that kids learn how to manage money, and wrote these series of books. These are children's books that she's both selling and donating to schools to underprivileged kids to learn about money, to learn about investment, to learn about value, to learn about return on. It's just a fundamental shift that I think is not available to most people. So I think starting with the kids is important. And there are people that know that, and that's what they do, and they're passionate about it. I'm going to continue to do the work that I do because it's what I know and what I'm passionate about. But it really is about wraparound services. It's really about treating people as people, showing them their value, showing them their agency. And also, I hate to say this, but recognizing that not everything is going to work out. Like it may be triage in some situations. There may only be a third of the population that we can give the resources to save themselves. We may not be able to help everybody else. But if we can start on that, then that next generation has a third stronger of the population. And that's going to grow eventually exponentially to the point where we actually are providing that. And not everybody's going to succeed. Not everybody's going to be a business owner. And especially for returning citizens and juveniles, we have this idea where we go and we talk to them about entrepreneurship and owning a business and investing. Not every one of them is going to own a business. Not every one of them is going to invest. Sometimes if they get out and get a job and stay out of trouble, that's the win. And that's what we go for, is allowing each person to kind of grow into whatever space they're capable of being in, or they're comfortable being in. And I would love to see everybody own their own business, succeed, and grow generational wealth. But sometimes if we can just keep them out of prison, we'll call that a win.
I would think so too. And I also like the message there where you're saying that start by recognizing them as people.
Yeah.
And then realize that each one of them is an individual that's going to have an individual backstory and an individual outcome. Exactly. And some people, they don't want to get all the way to home base, right? They're just trying to get on their way to first base, and any growth is growth. Yeah. So when for people that want to take a look at what you're doing and find ways to support it, where do they find you?
I'm all over social media, Second Chancer or second_chancer. The nonprofit is at second-chancer.org. You can go to jessecrosson.com, some of the public speaking, different things that I do personally. I've started to get a lot more consulting opportunities, which I really am surprised by. But what I recognize is there aren't a lot of people coming out of this space with lived experience and the ability to articulate that and kind of break down to the core of what the needs are, or what the wants are, or what the kind of like shift that could happen. And so it's really neat to feel empowered to share my experience for a good reason, not just to tell a story that somebody wants to hear about a prison fight, but to say, hey, how are we going to reform probation and parole? I'm going to be on the steering committee for this national office that is going to change federal parole all across the country. Like, that's amazing to me.
Well, that is something that is one of your superpowers. Your ability to articulate what the situation was like in a way that people that have never been there can deeply understand is exceptional.
Thank you.
Consultants often will bring you closer to the problem, which leads you to the solution. And for those people that are trying to solve problems related to inclusion, related to people that are working with a past that they have conflict with, those types of things, I can't imagine anybody would be better at that. And you were talking about a lady that is writing books for finance. Yeah. And I know somebody else that should be writing books.
Yeah, I know. I'm working on it. Thank you, Taylor, for the friendly reminder.
Always, man. I really feel as though you're on social media so much, and I get to catch up with like things that are going out that I don't reach out enough. And it's not to give you gears, but that's a reminder for me as well. I really appreciate you coming and doing this. I appreciate the time that we got to spend in South by Southwest. That was very meaningful to me. And that's something that you meet some people and you're like, oh, you were my friend regardless of where you came from, what has happened. You just like feel it, right? Yeah. And genuinely that's the same. So I am beyond the person that just got your back.
Thank you, sir. That means a lot. And I hope you're able to get away in July. I hope we can put this thing together. We can all meet up again.
That sounds awesome. Well, thanks again. We'll close it off for today. Is there anything else that you want to make sure that anybody knows before we break?
When I talk about the experience being universal, I hear from people every day who say, I'm in a place where I feel hopeless, either because of legal troubles or personal troubles or relationship troubles. And the biggest thing that I learned through all this experience is that I have to keep putting one foot in front of the other to see what tomorrow brings, because I have no idea. Because the day I woke up with 10 years left on my prison sentence and feeling like there was no chance, I went home. I was able to re-enter the world, and we never know what tomorrow is going to bring.
No kidding, eh? Just amazing. That's a great way to close. And thank you for joining us on Leadership Line of Sight. This has been Jesse Crosson. You can find him super easily because he is absolutely everywhere on social media. You do such a good job of that. And he is also the founder of Night is Day. You can look him up as Second Chancer. My name is Taylor. I am a serial entrepreneur and the host here of Leadership Line of Sight. Thanks so much for listening. I appreciate you.